When you look at a map of the United States today, you see 50 states neatly laid out, a unified country stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But this map wasn't always so clean and simple. The story of how it came to be is a complex and often brutal history of expansion, broken promises, and the colonization of a continent that was already home to millions of people. This is the story of how the United States colonized its own land. In 1776, at the birth of the nation, the original 13 colonies were just a narrow strip along the East Coast. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay a vast territory inhabited by hundreds of distinct indigenous nations, each with their own cultures, languages, and systems of government. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 had theoretically forbidden colonial settlement west of the Appalachians, but this line was constantly challenged by settlers hungry for land. With independence, the floodgates opened. The first major expansion came with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This act laid out a plan for governing the territory north of the Ohio River, what would eventually become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The ordinance stated that the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. This noble language, however, would become a pattern of empty promises. As settlers poured into the Ohio Valley, conflict with indigenous peoples like the Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware tribes became inevitable. The U.S. government used a combination of military force and manipulative treaties to seize land. Often, these treaties were signed under duress, with leaders who didn't represent the entire nation, or through outright deception. The Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 and the subsequent Treaty of Greenville forced numerous tribes to cede vast tracts of land in modern-day Ohio, setting a precedent for future land grabs. Then came the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. With a single transaction from France, the United States doubled its size overnight, acquiring 828,000 square miles of land. This territory was presented on maps as empty, but it was home to powerful nations like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Osage. President Thomas Jefferson, who orchestrated the purchase, envisioned an empire for liberty. But for the indigenous people living there, it marked the beginning of an existential threat. Jefferson's policy was one of Indian removal. He believed indigenous peoples had to either assimilate into American society or be moved west of the Mississippi River. This policy reached its brutal climax under President Andrew Jackson. In the Southeast, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, often called the Five Civilized Tribes, had adopted many aspects of American culture, including written language, constitutional governments, and farming practices. The Cherokee even took their land rights case to the Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, the court actually ruled in their favor, affirming their sovereignty. But President Jackson famously defied the court. He pushed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 through Congress, authorizing the federal government to forcibly relocate these nations. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in American history. The Trail of Tears. Between 1830 and 1850, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were forced from their ancestral homes in the Southeast and marched, often in chains and at gunpoint, to so-called Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exposure during the grueling journey. As the nation pushed westward, the concept of manifest destiny took hold in the 1840s. This was the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the entire continent. It was a powerful ideological tool that justified the annexation of Texas in 1845, the Mexican-American War, and the acquisition of the entire Southwest California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Once again, lands that had been home to indigenous peoples and Mexican citizens for generations were redrawn as American territory. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 triggered a massive wave of migration, further devastating native populations. Settlers, miners, and the U.S. Army carried out a campaign of extermination against California's indigenous peoples. State-sanctioned militias were paid to hunt and kill them, and the native population plummeted from an estimated 150,000 to just 30,000 in a few short decades. In the Great Plains, the horse-riding cultures of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho faced their own onslaught. The construction of transcontinental railroads, the near extermination of the bison, their primary source of food and cultural significance, and a series of brutal wars shattered their way of life. Treaties like the Fort Laramie Treaties of 1851 and 1868 were supposed to guarantee tribal lands, but they were consistently violated once gold or other valuable resources were discovered. The Black Hills of South Dakota, sacred to the Lakota, were promised to them, for as long as the grass shall grow. But the discovery of gold led to the Great Sioux War of 1876 and the U.S. seizure of the land. By the late 19th century, the era of open warfare was largely over, replaced by a new policy: reservations and assimilation. Indigenous peoples were confined to small, often barren parcels of land, completely dependent on government rations that were frequently inadequate or corruptly administered. The goal was to erase their cultures. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up communally owned reservation lands into individual plots, a concept foreign to most indigenous cultures. The surplus land was then sold off to white settlers, further reducing the native land base by nearly 100 million acres. At the same time, the government established a system of off-reservation boarding schools. The philosophy was simple and cruel. Kill the Indian, save the man. Children were forcibly taken from their families. Their hair was cut, their traditional clothes were replaced with uniforms, and they were forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their spiritual beliefs. The goal was to completely sever their connection to their heritage. The map of America's expansion is not just a story of lines on paper. It's a map of displacement, of treaties made and broken, and of a systematic effort to dispossess and eliminate the continent's original inhabitants. From the Ohio Valley to the shores of California, the growth of the United States was fundamentally a process of colonization. Recognizing this history is not about assigning guilt. It's about understanding the foundation upon which the country was built and acknowledging the deep and lasting impact it has had on indigenous peoples. Today, Native American nations continue to fight for their sovereignty, their land rights, and the preservation of their cultures. The history of this expansion is still being written as a new generation grapples with the legacy of this continental conquest. The map of the United States looks complete, but the story it tells is far from over. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time.